Good day, troops, and everybody else supporting Veterans for Freedom. This is James Formosa coming to you today with a contribution looking into an analysis of a recent CTV article from this week, which attempts to explain the tweaks that are apparently coming from the Chief of Defense Staff with regards to CDS Directive 002, the former mandate for COVID-19 vaccination in soldiers that is currently suspended and supposed to be replaced by 003. Now, I want to read this CTV article to you all and draw your attention to a few specific parts because I believe, according to what information we now have on the leaked CDS 003 document, it seems that this article is making demonstrably factually false statements as far as I can tell. And as well, I think it's very important that we do draw the public's attention to some of the more egregious issues in the new directive that is supposed to be released at some point in the near future, perhaps by early September. Now, let's take a look at this article. Top commander defends military's vaccine requirement, says a tweak is in the works. Canada's top military commander said he will tweak the vaccine mandate for the armed forces in the next few weeks, but defended vaccine requirements as necessary to keep the military ready to respond to any emergency. Quote, "This is an institution that's unlike any other because we do have to be operationally ready. We are the nation's insurance policy," Chief of Defense Staff General Wayne Eyre told the Canadian press in an interview. Quote, "We have to go into dangerous locations and close confined quarters. We have to deploy overseas where there's potentially an increased threat with the pandemic. We also don't know the trajectory of this pandemic, where it's going to go into the future." When Eyre when Eyre ordered all troops vaccinated against COVID-19 last October, he said it was to both protect and the force and to demonstrate leadership as the Liberal government adopted vaccine mandates across the federal public service. The public service vaccine mandate was suspended, however, in June, but the military one persists, a fact that has heightened criticism of the military's policy. The Department of National Defense said more than 98% of Canadian troops complied with the order. Defense Minister Anita Anand was briefed in June that 1,137 remained unvaccinated. Those who refuse vaccination face the risk of forced removal from the military, like myself. The department says 241 unvaccinated troops have been ousted, with disciplinary measures initiated against hundreds more. Eyre said that he is trying to find, quote, "the sweet spot between the military's medical, legal, operational, and ethical requirements." Quote, "We need to maintain our operational viability going forward," he said. "So over the course of the next number of weeks, we will tweak the policy. We'll put out something amended. But we also need to realize that this is a dynamic environment and things can change. The trajectory of the pandemic can change. So we've got to maintain that flexibility as well," end quote. He added that not only has the military been called upon to assist in communities across Canada that have been hit by the pandemic, but that the vaccine requirement still exists in many allied and foreign nations and militaries. The US military still requires all troops to be vaccinated, as do some NATO facilities and bases. Quote, "There are going to be operational requirements where, to operate with allies, vaccination is going to be essential," he said. "But as we go forward, the options are being developed looking at those four factors that I talked about and finding the right balance." Eyre's comments appear to contradict a draft copy of a revised vaccine policy obtained by the Ottawa Citizen last month, which suggested vaccine requirements for military personnel would be lifted. The draft document, which officials say has not yet been approved by Eyre, said military personnel as well as new recruits would no longer have to attest to their vaccination status. The document also noted potential legal difficulties ahead to deal with people who were kicked out of the military, like myself, because of the vaccine mandate, suggesting they could be forced to apply for re-enrollment. Now, keep this in mind, folks. This is something that's very important, and I will be going over CDS Directive 003 with you at the conclusion of this article to show that this seems to be demonstrably false. Nowhere from what I have seen in the leaked draft copy of CDS Directive 003 does it say that anyone could be forced to apply for re-enrollment. Rather, it looks like they're going to make it very difficult for anybody to re-enroll even if they wanted to, and that it would only be possible with a waiver signed by the Chief of Defense Staff himself. But we'll get to that at the conclusion of this article. Continuing on. By contrast, other unvaccinated federal public servants were put on leave without pay, but allowed to return to their jobs when the mandate was suspended. The military mandate was unsuccessfully challenged several times in federal court, most recently last month. Philip Miller, the London, Ontario-based lawyer who appeared before the court to seek an injunction on behalf of unvaccinated service members, said the court ultimately decided it couldn't rule on the issue until the new policy was released. Miller, who is also representing James Topp, an Army reservist charged with publicly speaking out against the federal vaccine mandates while wearing his uniform, said he was disappointed with the decision given the lack of timeline for the new policy. The military is deliberately dragging its feet on this new direction because it just wants to kick people out, Miller alleged, adding, "It's obviously a political policy, not an operational policy." Iyer would not say whether armed forces members are still being kicked out or whether such releases have been suspended pending the results of his review. The Defense Department says there have been more than 9,500 cases of COVID-19 among military personnel, including 113 active cases as of August 1st. It did not say whether there have been any deaths associated with the illness. I think we should all be keen to wonder why they won't release information like that as well. Now, to my first point, and arguably one of the most important ones, it is interesting that that article mentioned that members could be potentially forced to re-enroll in the armed forces. Now, if we actually go and look at the leaked draft copy of CDS Directive 003, which was provided to me by an anonymous source from within the military, it will show something that attests to the exact opposite. Here on the 14th page of CDS Directive 003, ostensibly, keep in mind, none of this is legally binding or effectual in the armed forces, of course, because it is yet to be signed and dated by the Chief of Defense Staff himself. However, the leaked draft copy does say on page 14, CAF members released due to the COVID-19 vaccination requirement will be permitted to apply to re-enroll. Re-enrollment applications from members who received a compulsory Category 5F, unsuitable for further service, release will require a CDS waiver. Now, the requirement of a waiver sounds an awful lot different than the CTV article here claiming that folks like myself would be forced to re-enroll. As you could well imagine, many of us would be incredibly reluctant to ever want to work for the institution, at least as it's currently constituted with this level of lack of accountability or oversight. Now, before I conclude this discussion today, I would also like to draw everyone's attention to some of the more pernicious policies in this leaked draft document of CDS Directive 003. And perhaps on our longer form shows in the near future, we'll go into a deeper dive of this entire document. But for right now, most importantly, I think, is the 13th page, which outlines how the Chief of Defense Staff and the Canadian Armed Forces sees this process going forward once CDS Directive 003 is instituted. On page 13, subpara 1, it states, the CAF members whose non-compliance with the CDS directives on CAF COVID-19 vaccination has resulted in an AR, or administrative review decision directing compulsory release, whose release date remains in the future, will be released from the CAF in accordance with that decision. In other words, if you are a Canadian Armed Forces member that's at the level of administrative review, which is rather the final stages of the disciplinary process for refusing to comply with 002, most of which is for members who believe that that order in itself is unlawful. Nevertheless, if you are at the administrative review level, according to the new policy that's supposed to supersede it, you are still meant to be released in accordance with a decision made in the past for a directive that has already been suspended for now over a month. Subpara 2 says, CAF members who have been served with a notice of intent to recommend release and whose file has been submitted for administrative review pending a final decision on release will be subject to the decision on release being determined in the coming weeks. And now this is arguably the most important and most frighteningly Orwellian part of this new process. It states in subpara here 3, ongoing remedial measure processes, that is recorded warning and or counseling and probation for CAF members due to non-compliance with the CDS directives on CAF COVID-19 vaccination will be terminated effective the date of this directive due to the suspension of the requirement. However, it also says here, records of the remedial measures and administrative review processes for non-compliance will be retained on the member's personal files and may be considered in the case of future instances of performance or conduct deficiency by the member. Now, what does this mean exactly? Essentially, this is stating that if you were at the earlier stages of the disciplinary process, that being recorded warning or counseling and probation, the disciplinary process is meant to be put on pause or to stop, but your file and the disciplinary files related to you not complying with the old, now no longer effectual directive will stay in your personnel file as evidence of your wrongthink. In other words, for all of these members, arguably nearly the entire swath of those that have been not only resistant to CDS Directive 002, but have also filed hundreds of grievances with lengthy explanations about how that directive violates both the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Human Rights Act with regards to prohibited grounds of discrimination in a workplace. Nevertheless, they're going to keep your resistance and your integrity as evidence of rather a performance or a conduct deficiency. So in other words, the Canadian Armed Forces, as it's currently constituted in the chain of command, is essentially stating that members who have the integrity and the conscience and the willpower to resist in order that they believe and have evidence and attempt to argue is manifestly unlawful will have that kept on their personnel file as evidence of their poor behavior or unwillingness to toe the party line. For Veterans for Freedom, I'm James Formosa. Thank you for listening to this important special message today.